The sound of the courtroom clock was faint, but the scratch of the pen was not. Julian Ward signed his name with dramatic flourish, dragging the black ink slowly across the final page of their divorce decree. He didn't just sign it, he performed it. Sitting across from him, Elena Brooks kept her eyes fixed on the table, but her hand rested lightly on an old silver fountain pen, one that once belonged to her father, Arthur Brooks, the famed novelist everyone in that room pretended not to recognize. Julian looked up, pen still twirling between his fingers. "Well," he said with a half-laugh, "I suppose the fairy tale's over. Too bad about the ending." The judge didn't react. Elena didn't blink. Inside, her stomach coiled. Not from heartbreak. That part had withered months ago. What tightened her chest was the way Julian smiled. Like he had won. Like she had been just another stepping stone on the path to his literary career. He had always admired her father, quoted him, obsessed over his legacy. And once Arthur Brooks died, Julian wasted no time carving a piece of it for himself. Elena remembered the first time she caught Julian reading through her father's unpublished manuscripts. He said it was just research, that it was inspiring. Back then, she believed him. Back then, she believed in a lot of things. The pen between her fingers now was the one her father used to write every first draft. Julian had once asked to use it. She said no. He used her instead. Julian pushed the signed pages towards the judge and leaned back, casual and victorious. "All done. Hope you find someone less boring next time." Elena said nothing. She had promised herself, "Not one tear, not one twitch." The judge adjusted his glasses, then reached into a folder. "There is one final matter," he said. "This court has received a sealed document, submitted posthumously by Mr. Arthur Brooks, regarding the literary estate in question." Julian's smirk faded. Elena raised her eyes. Slowly, the judge lifted an envelope, thick ivory with a deep red wax seal. The initials A.B. were pressed firmly in the center. The courtroom air tightened. Julian sat up straighter. "Wait, what document? Why wasn't I told?" "This envelope was delivered to the court with specific instructions, to be opened only during these proceedings, in the event that Mr. Julian Ward attempts to claim ownership or authorship of any intellectual property linked to Mr. Brooks's legacy." Julian's jaw clenched. "That's absurd. This is a divorce, not a copyright case." But Elena already knew. She knew exactly what was inside that envelope, and she knew the exact moment her father had written it. Her voice was quiet, barely audible to anyone but him. "He saw you coming, Julian, long before I did." The judge broke the seal. The wax cracked like thunder in Julian's ears. Elena's fingers tightened around the silver pen. He had built a life on borrowed brilliance. But the man who thought he could rewrite her story was about to be erased by the author who loved her most. And just before the judge began to read, I realized something I hadn't dared to hope in months. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the prologue to his ruin. If you had asked anyone just 2 years ago, they would have said I was the luckiest woman they knew. I had a calm job as a university librarian, a peaceful little apartment near the river, and a husband who taught literature and spoke on panels. People used words like graceful, elegant, and reserved when they described me, never knowing that what they were really describing was someone carefully erasing herself for someone else's spotlight. I wasn't loud. I didn't need attention. I liked the rustle of pages, the scent of old books, the stillness of stories waiting to be opened. But Julian Ward hated the quiet. He wanted applause, and when we got married, I think a part of him believed he had married into legacy. My legacy. My father's. Arthur Brooks wasn't just a writer. He was a literary force. His novels were taught in universities, quoted by politicians, whispered between readers like scripture. He wrote with fire and elegance, and he never cared for fame. That was what made him beloved. Julian used to sit on our living room floor, surrounded by my father's early works, tracing his finger along the margin notes in pencil. He said they were divine. I thought it was devotion. Now I know it was research. When we first met, Julian seemed magnetic. His words felt like honey, his eyes always filled with admiration. He told me I was unlike anyone he'd ever met. But what he really meant was that I was unlike anyone who would ever challenge him. He was always the loudest voice at dinner parties, the man who quoted Rilke before dessert. People adored him, and slowly I faded. Willingly at first. After my father passed, Julian insisted we keep the study as it was. A shrine, he said, to greatness. But I began to notice things missing, little things. A handwritten draft that had sat on the second shelf for years. The fountain pen, my father's, had been borrowed and returned scratched. A quote from a private letter suddenly appeared in Julian's new novel. I asked once, gently, "Did you take Dad's old story outline?" He smiled too easily. "Of course not, but if I did, wouldn't it be fair inspiration? He was your father. Our family. Our family." That word clanged in my ears. At faculty events, people praised Julian's new book, called it Brooksian in tone, but with youthful fire. He soaked it in, never once mentioned where the tone came from, and I said nothing. Because for years I had been taught, by silence, by culture, by watching my mother, that grace meant never making a scene. But inside me, something tightened every time he smiled too long at praise. Every time he described me in interviews as his anchor while taking wind for his own sails. Then came the day I found the document. A full draft, unedited, unformatted, tucked into Julian's desk drawer. Not in his handwriting. My father's. Dated 8 years earlier. It was the same plot, the same twist, the same metaphor. Julian had copied nearly everything, and just changed the names. I sat there, staring at it for hours, my mind numb, my hands trembling. It was like finding fingerprints at a crime scene. But the burglar lived in my house, ate at my table, and wore a wedding ring with my name on it. That night, I didn't confront him. Not yet. I walked into my father's study, shut the door, and cried for the version of me that still believed this was love. On the desk, the silver fountain pen waited like a ghost. I picked it up and wrote a single line in the blank margin of one of his old notebooks. Strength isn't staying silent, it's knowing when to speak. I didn't know it yet, but that line would become the line I whispered in court, the one Julian would never forget. But before I could say a word to him, something happened. Something that told me I wasn't alone in what I had seen, and my father hadn't been blind before he died. It was a Tuesday afternoon, gray and quiet, the kind of day Elena Brooks usually loved. Rain tapped against the library windows, and the scent of paper filled the air like incense. But on that day, she wasn't cataloging books or refiling returns. She was staring at the door. Julian hadn't come home the night before. Not that it was new. Lately, late nights at the office had become normal. So had unexplained trips, mumbled calls in the other room, perfume that wasn't hers. But she had stopped asking. She told herself it wasn't her business anymore. Their lives were already splitting down the middle. Emotionally, she had already left. But what she hadn't expected, what truly rattled her, was that someone else knew. She was shelving a stack of poetry anthologies when the door to the staff-only section opened. No one should have been there. She turned and saw a woman standing in the threshold. Tall, sharp eyes, confidence wrapped around her like armor. "Elena Brooks?" the woman asked, voice low, professional. Yes? I'm Nadia Voss. I represent Hargrave Literary Management. Elena froze. Hargrave was Julian's new agency, the one that had landed him the six-figure deal. I think there's been a mistake. This is a university library. I'm not— But Nadia shook her head. Actually, I'm here about Arthur Brooks. The name stopped Elena cold. Nadia stepped forward. I recently acquired a folder of archived materials from your father's previous editor. Notes, drafts, and a contract dated nearly 12 years ago. It appears your father had submitted a manuscript, one that bears an alarming resemblance to your husband's debut novel. Elena didn't speak. She couldn't. I wanted to come directly to you before this goes public, Nadia continued. I believe your father's unpublished work was taken, possibly repurposed without permission. Julian's book. The one everyone praised. The one that launched him. Elena felt the edges of her world tilt. She had suspected, yes, but suspicion is a whisper. This was thunder. Do you have the manuscript? Elena asked quietly. Nadia reached into her bag and pulled out a sealed envelope. A photocopy. The original is in our archive, but you should see it. Elena took it with trembling hands. That night, she read the pages under a single lamp. Rain still falling against the window. Her father's handwriting was unmistakable. His voice was there in every paragraph. The rhythm, the themes, the metaphor of the orchard tree. Everything. And Julian's version? Almost word for word. Except he'd stripped the soul and replaced it with flair. He made the story louder, prettier, shallower. But the skeleton was Arthur Brooks, and now she had proof. The next morning she returned to the library early, the envelope still in her bag, close to her ribs. She walked past Julian's published book on the faculty authors shelf, pulled it out, and flipped through it. On the dedication page it read, "To E.B., who steadied my hand when I wrote, and to A.B., whose brilliance lit the path." She nearly laughed. Julian had thanked the very man he stole from, because he knew no one would ever look too closely. Until now. Later that day, she visited her father's study. She hadn't entered in weeks. Dust hung like silence in the air. She set the envelope on the desk and whispered, "You knew, didn't you?" She opened the desk drawer carefully, and there it was, a black leather notebook she hadn't seen before. Tucked underneath were bank transfer slips, copies of email printouts, even a scribbled note in her father's hand. If he publishes it, this will protect her. Her knees buckled. Her father hadn't just seen Julian. He had prepared for war, and that's when I realized my father hadn't left me behind. He'd left me a weapon. All I had to do was choose to use it. The confrontation didn't come with slamming doors or shouting voices. That would have made it easier. No, it came quietly, like most of Julian Ward's betrayals. It was Thursday evening. The sky outside their apartment was bleeding orange into dusk. Elena stood in the kitchen, the copy of her father's manuscript still sealed in her bag, tucked behind her back like a secret waiting to be spoken. Julian walked in humming. "Elle," he called out, as if they hadn't been sleeping in different rooms for weeks. "You won't believe the article they wrote about me in Litline. They're calling me a voice that echoes the legacy of Brooks. Can you imagine?" She said nothing. He walked into the kitchen, loosened his tie, kissed her cheek without waiting for permission. "What's for dinner?" She turned slowly. "Did you ever meet my father's first editor?" Julian blinked. Elijah Crane," she said. "Small office. Only published 3 authors in his entire career." Julian tilted his head, calculating. "I think I've heard the name." "Why?" She studied his face, the twitch in his left cheek, the smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "His archive was transferred to Hargrave Management." "Oh?" Julian sipped water. "That's your father's old agency, isn't it?" She let the silence hang. Then, deliberately, She set a photocopy of the manuscript on the table. Julian stared and froze. "Elena," he started. She didn't move. "I haven't read your new book in a while. Remind me, how does it end?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The facade cracked, just a hairline. "Elena, this is a misunderstanding. Look, authors borrow ideas all the time. Inspiration isn't theft." She said nothing. He took a step forward. "Come on. You know how much I admired your father. You know how close we were. I was honoring him." She raised her eyes, finally, calm, flat. "You dedicated the book you stole to the man you stole it from." Julian's breath caught. "Elena, listen, if this goes to court—" "It's not in court yet." He paled. "You wouldn't. It's your name too, your father's legacy. Do you really want the world digging through that?" And there it was, the first glimpse of real fear in Julian Ward. Not for what he had done, but for the consequences he couldn't control. That night, Elena sat alone on the balcony. The city lights blurred below like a memory she couldn't quite focus. Her hands were cold. Her chest felt hollow. She had spoken the truth. Finally. But instead of feeling lighter, she felt exposed. She remembered something her father once told her when she was 16. Some men don't fear being wrong. They fear being seen. The next morning, Julian was gone. Not gone as in vanished, but gone in the way cowards disappear before a storm. His side of the bed was empty. No note, no apology. Just his book, still lying open on the counter, like he wanted it to remind her of his version of the truth. She didn't touch it. She didn't need to read lies anymore. Later that day, she called Leah Kim, her childhood friend, now a litigator with steel in her voice and scars behind her smile. Elena hadn't spoken to her in months, not since the funeral. Leah picked up after the second ring. "Elena? I need help." "Legal?" "Personal," Elena whispered. "But also, yes, very legal." There was a pause. Then Leah said, "Tell me everything," and Elena did. By the time I finished, Leah didn't ask if we should take him down. She asked how fast I needed it to happen. Leah Kim didn't ask for time. She asked for facts. 2 hours after Elena hung up, Leah was in her apartment with coffee, 3 legal pads, and a voice recorder. "I don't want to just protect you," she said. "I want to expose him, fully, publicly." Elena stared at her friend. Polished blazer, sharp eyes, that unshakable calm she remembered from childhood. "You really think we can win?" "I don't think," Leah said, flipping open a notebook. "I know." Over the next several days, they met in Arthur Brooks's old study. Elena hadn't realized how much dust had settled on the bookshelves, or how loud silence could be when you were filling it with truth. They spread out documents across the old oak desk, emails, contracts, manuscripts. Leah went through every line like a surgeon with a scalpel. "What we have here," she said, tapping her pen on the margin of one contract, "is intent. Julian didn't just copy. He planned. He removed your father's name, shifted keywords, he manipulated metadata. This wasn't inspiration. This was theft, calculated and careful." Elena nodded. "He knew no one would question him. He used the family name to disarm suspicion." Leah leaned back. "But he forgot who your father really was. He left breadcrumbs." On the 5th day, Elena pulled out the black leather notebook, the one she found hidden beneath her father's papers. Inside were handwritten notes that detailed every change Julian had made to the original manuscript. "He's trying to make it louder," one margin said. "Louder doesn't mean better." Her father had seen it. He hadn't confronted Julian, he had documented him. "This," Leah whispered, eyes wide, "is gold. Contemporaneous documentation. He was building this case for you." Elena ran her fingers along her father's writing. He had fought for her long after he was gone. That night, Elena stood at the window of her apartment, watching raindrops race each other down the glass. She used to feel small in moments like this. Now she felt steady. Julian had once told her she was too soft to survive the world of men. She smiled just slightly, because what he never understood, what he would never understand, was that softness wasn't weakness. It was silence before thunder. The following week, Leah filed the initial motion with the court. The response came fast. Too fast. Julian's lawyer requested a protective order. "He's panicking," Leah said, eyes narrowing. "He's trying to bury the evidence before it even sees daylight." Elena didn't flinch. "Let him panic." Word began to spread through the academic grapevine. Whispers in hallways. Emails with "confidential" in all caps. One faculty member at Julian's department quietly forwarded a screenshot to Leah. "Julian Ward has been placed on temporary leave pending internal investigation." Another sent an anonymous message. "He told us she was crazy, but we're seeing the truth now." One evening, Elena and Leah sat by the fireplace in Arthur's study, surrounded by boxes of case files and fading photographs. "I never thought I'd be back here," Elena said softly. "Not like this." "You're not just back," Leah said, pouring tea into chipped porcelain. "You're reclaiming it." Elena looked around the room. The shelves. The leather chair where her father used to sit. The pen that still rested in the drawer. Her voice was quiet but clear. "This is no longer his story. It's mine now. And the next time Julian saw me, I wasn't holding papers. I was holding proof." The courtroom felt colder than Elena remembered. Maybe it was the marble floors. Maybe it was the weight of what she carried in her briefcase. Or maybe it was because Julian was already there, sitting smugly at the defendant's table in his tailored suit, smiling like a man who thought he'd already won. He didn't look at her as she entered. He didn't need to, because men like Julian don't expect storms from quiet skies. Leah Kim stood beside her, calm and precise. Her expression unreadable, but her presence grounding. They took their seats at the plaintiff's side. The judge entered. "Ms. Brooks," the judge said, adjusting his glasses. "You may proceed." Leah rose first. "Your Honor, we are submitting into evidence a collection of materials relevant to both the intellectual property and character claims against Mr. Ward." She placed the black notebook on the table. "This includes dated annotations, early manuscript drafts, correspondence, and contemporaneous documentation in Arthur Brooks's handwriting." Julian shifted in his seat. "And," Leah continued, sliding forward the final copy of Julian's published book, "a comparative literary analysis between the defendant's work and the unpublished manuscript from Mr. Brooks' archive." Julian's lawyer stood abruptly. "Objection, relevance and authenticity." But the judge didn't even blink. "This court is authorized to review claims of contested authorship when tied to a state violation and fraud. Objection overruled." Julian's jaw tightened. Leah opened the notebook, turned it toward the court, and read aloud. "He's not writing. He's copying. My words, my structure, my metaphor. And he thinks I don't see it. I see it all." Arthur Brooks, handwritten, 2 years before publication. The courtroom was silent. Not a breath, not a sound. Elena didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She simply looked at Julian. And for the first time, he looked back. But his eyes didn't hold arrogance this time. They held recognition, not of her, of the power she now wielded. He stood up suddenly. "This is character assassination," he said loudly. "She's doing this to ruin me because she's bitter about the divorce." The judge tapped the gavel once. "Mr. Ward, sit down." Leah didn't even look up. "We have bank records, time-stamped cloud metadata, and sworn statements from faculty aware of Mr. Ward's early drafts." Julian's lawyer leaned in, whispering furiously. Julian's face drained of color. And then came the final blow. Elena rose from her seat. She hadn't planned to speak, but she had carried too many silences, too many locked truths. She walked to the front. hands steady, her father's silver pen clipped to her dress. "This wasn't revenge," she said calmly. "This was restoration." She placed the original manuscript on the stand, placed the notebook beside it, then looked directly at Julian. "I don't need to destroy you, Julian. You did that yourself. All I'm doing is turning the lights on." The judge leaned forward. "This court will recess and reconvene this afternoon for preliminary rulings. But I must say," he looked directly at Julian, "the materials submitted are not only damning, they are devastating." Julian sat down. Hard. His hand trembled as he reached for a glass of water. As Elena returned to her seat, Leah whispered, "You didn't just win the room, you changed the narrative." And this time Elena did smile. Just a little. Because this time, it wasn't Julian's story anymore. "I walked into court carrying silence. I left carrying the truth. And Julian, he left carrying nothing." The headline spread faster than Elena ever imagined. One blog post, then a local news clip, then a full national feature on the literary fallout from the courtroom. Julian Ward, accused of literary theft in landmark estate battle. Arthur Brooks' daughter reclaims the legacy he tried to steal. In her father's words, she found her own. Elena didn't ask for the spotlight, but it came anyway. And this time it didn't burn. It illuminated. The university issued a quiet but public statement. "Professor Ward is no longer affiliated with this institution. We regret any harm caused to the Brooks family and literary community." The faculty lounge that once whispered about her now avoided eye contact when she walked past. The same professors who had once described Julian as a visionary now used phrases like ethical violation and unacceptable conduct. And in a gesture more symbolic than practical, the administration invited her to speak at the upcoming Writers' Forum. At first, she declined, but it was Leah who reminded her, "This isn't just about clearing your name. It's about rewriting the rules of who gets to tell the story." She said yes. The auditorium was full. Rows of young writers, literature students, and professors filled every seat. Elena stood backstage, her hands steady, her father's silver pen tucked into her dress pocket. Not as armor this time, but as bloodline. She had written her speech the night before. 3 drafts, all torn apart. The 4th one she wrote in ink, with that pen, under the same lamplight where her father once worked. When her name was called, the applause was instant. She stepped to the podium and waited. Not for silence, but for stillness. Then she began, "I grew up believing that silence was strength, that not speaking made you elegant, that not challenging made you dignified. But I've learned the hard way. Silence is only noble when it's a choice, not when it's expected. My father was a man of letters, but more than that, he was a man of principles. And when someone tried to rewrite his words as their own, I stayed silent at first, because I was taught that rage made you weak, that women didn't confront, that daughters didn't accuse." She paused, eyes scanning the room. "But here's what I know now. Being quiet doesn't protect you from betrayal. Being kind doesn't make you immune to theft. And sometimes the only way to honor someone's voice is to raise your own." After the talk, dozens of students lined up to speak to her. Some wanted signatures, others just wanted to thank her. One young woman, trembling slightly, stepped forward. "I was Julian's TA last year," she said softly. "He told us you were unstable, that you resented his success." Elena's smile didn't falter. "You believed him?" "I did," she admitted, "but I don't anymore, and I wanted to say I'm sorry." Elena took her hand. "What matters is what you believe now. That's more powerful than regret." Later that week, she received an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single photograph. It was of her father, younger, sitting at his typewriter, head tilted mid-thought. Tucked inside the photo was a sticky note. He knew his words would outlive him, but he never imagined you'd become one of them. There was no name, but she didn't need one. That evening, she returned to her father's study. The fire was low, crackling softly. She opened the drawer, held the silver pen for a long moment, then placed it back down, not because she was done, but because she no longer needed to hold it like a weapon. It was no longer a shield, it was a seed. Instead, she opened her laptop and began drafting the charter for something new, the Brooks Fellowship for Ethical Writing, a fund dedicated to supporting writers from marginalized voices, those whose words were often edited out of the literary narrative. She wasn't just protecting legacy anymore, she was building one of her own. He tried to erase me from my father's story. Instead, I became the footnote that rewrote the ending. The courtroom felt different this time. Same marble floor, same judge, same long wooden benches. But this time Julian Ward didn't sit with a smirk. He sat with his eyes lowered, his tie loose, his hands fidgeting on the table like they no longer knew what to hold on to. And Elena Brooks? She didn't sit like a woman betrayed. She stood like a woman becoming. The judge read slowly. In light of the submitted documentation, the court recognizes Arthur Brooks as the sole author of the disputed manuscript. All rights associated with the work, and any profit derived thereof, are transferred to the Brooks estate, now legally overseen by Ms. Elena Brooks. Julian said nothing. He didn't interrupt this time. He simply stared ahead, like a man watching the house he built collapse in silence. The judge continued. Furthermore, this court finds that Mr. Ward's actions constitute intellectual property fraud and intentional defamation of character. We refer all supporting evidence to the appropriate civil and academic authorities. The gavel came down, once, clear, final. Elena walked out of the courtroom alone. She wasn't followed by cameras. She didn't make a statement. She didn't need to, because when the truth stands on its own, it doesn't need a press release. It leaves an echo. She returned to her apartment that evening, changed out of her courtroom dress, and sat quietly in her father's study. The bookshelf was untouched, still holding volumes of his work, and now hers. On the desk was a single item, the silver fountain pen. She picked it up, clicked it once, then wrote one line on the back of a folded court notice. Justice begins the moment you stop waiting for permission to speak. A knock came at the door. Leah. In one hand, she held a document. In the other, a smirk. What's that? Elena asked. Final settlement copy, Leah said, handing it over. And a bonus. She pulled a business card from her coat pocket. Hargrave Literary Management, Elena Brooks, author, forcipour, founder, the Brooks Fellowship. I didn't agree to be represented, Elena said softly. You didn't need to, Leah replied. They came to you. Later that week, as she boxed up Julian's remaining books from the apartment, she found one copy with a note still tucked inside. It read, "To the one who steadied my hand." She stared at it for a long moment, then slid it into the shredder. The final chapter didn't end in applause. It ended in clarity. She no longer needed to defend her place in the story, because she had become the author of her own. And the man who tried to steal her father's voice would now be remembered as a footnote in her legacy. He thought he wrote the last word, but the last word was always mine. She hadn't eaten all day, but someone else was hungrier, and that changed everything. It was 9:46 p.m. when Lauren Miller finally sat down. Not as a waitress, not as the one taking orders or clearing plates, but just for 5 minutes, as a girl with a tray in her hands and a dream in her eyes. The burger was still hot, the fries still golden and crisp. It was the first real meal she'd allowed herself in 3 days. She'd skipped breakfast to pay for her mother's insulin. She'd walked 5 miles instead of taking the bus. She'd collected coins from tip jars and saved napkins in her purse. Because tonight, just tonight, she wanted to taste something more than sacrifice. But the moment she lifted the tray, she saw them, a man and a woman, soaked, silent, huddled in the corner booth by the window, The one people usually reserved for first dates and birthday surprises. They didn't belong here. Not because they were white, not because they were old, but because they looked misplaced.